The Human Perspective. Chapter 3. Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel can be seen in several ways based on how one approaches God's existence. In our current mental exercise, we are searching to frame the role of God as an external force, one that exists to teach us important lessons about our own nature. As we will see in this story, we will frame God's presence twice. Once as a father figure and later on as the voice of Cain's subconscious. I came to believe that by doing so, we allow ourselves to learn different lessons, each with its own importance. The story describes the event of two brothers, Cain and Abel. The totality of the events is described shortly and finish as if they had no importance to the future development of the book. After describing the events, the story ends by moving forward to the next son of Abram and his offspring Genesis 4:25. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth, for she said, "God has appointed for me another child instead of Abel because Cain killed him." The story itself could be removed from the book and not affect its continuation. Regardless of it, the story is the second in line, hinting about the importance of its existence. By all accounts, it is there to teach us something, a fundamental truth about human nature and the way we interact with reality. As we will see, it is a lesson about family, the pain of living with our actions, and the fact that life goes on. At first, we will look at the story framing God as a father figure. The story starts by describing two brothers. It is said that one was working the field while the other was a keeper of sheep. I believe that this description exists first and foremost for two reasons. The first concerns the idea that the two brothers were different, a common reality in a family. Brothers tend to have opposite personalities. It can be explained by the need of the second brother to shine in his own medium, taking the opposite stand of his existing brother almost instinctively. It is a natural process of evolution, as the need for attention and admiration from one parent is part of each child's need. In many cases, if the first son is quiet, the second will be noisier, and vice versa. If the first son is a rebel, the second son will be a conformist, and vice versa. The second reason for this separation has to do with the meaning of the two different occupations. Working the land is hard work. This occupation is fundamental for human existence, while keeping the sheep is more passive and not of the same magnitude of importance. These differences can be seen as an analogy to human occupation in general. Some work requires knowledge, hard and constant effort, work that has to do with creation and sweat. In contrast, other work can be seen as less demanding, more passive, and requiring only general supervision. A direct comparison in ancient times can be the politician and the warrior, and, in our days, the comparison of office work to manual work or white-collar jobs to blue-collar jobs. Both jobs are necessary for a functional society, allowing the creation of a prosperous civilization. Regardless, a clear separation exists between the two, and historical tension naturally erupts between them. The story continues by describing the brothers' contribution to God and how one was superior to the other. The fact that God showed any preference to start with is surprising if the story is taken on its face. Why should God show such a preference? Did he not know that preferential treatment must eventually bring animosity? Why should one contribution be worth more than another to start with? Does the contribution itself not the crucial part of the act? A description of society arises at the beginning of the story. As a side note, the story's existence reflects something meaningful about humanity as a whole. I believe that God in this story represents society or authority by itself. Based on this approach, the contribution can be seen as the tax paid by today's workforce or the general productivity and prestige one gets from his occupation. Looking at it in that way justifies the preference described in the text. Since the beginning of time, different occupations had more prestige than others and rewarded people unequally. This reward and social status often do not reflect how hard the practical work is. It has to do with the perception of society and the dominant approach of the community as a whole. It is not uncommon for a society to see the hardest occupation as less admirable. First, people inspire to live well, making them admire the people who seem to live that way. The projection of one ambition, often subconsciously, can lead to a natural attraction for the sake of their status. Secondly, hard jobs take a lot from a person, creating exhaustion and little free time. For a society that takes its value from the induvial wish for comfort, there is little to admire in physical labor's work. Paradoxically enough, in many cases, as in our story, the prestige type of work is built on the existence of the physical laborer. A manager cannot manage without working people. Present-day farming animals will be impossible without agricultural cultivation. Socialist theory of recent history based their value on this division in society. A classic example of this struggle can be found in Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. The fact that our story starts by describing the division of labor shows us the inevitability of the division itself. Back to our story. The division of labor and the inclination of God toward a preferential attitude can be seen as a description of the family structure. In many cases, a parent will have some preference for one of the kids. It can happen subconsciously or due to high expectations from a specific kid. As a father figure, God is seen as showing a preference for one of his sons, reflecting a very common phenomenon. Alternatively, as the story's protagonist is the son, as in many cases in a family structure, one of the sons sees himself as inferior to his brother. This can happen without any clear preference from the parent side. It is highly destructive and can create long and persistent enmities between brothers. If this is the case, the story of Cain and Abel starts by describing one of the most destructive and still common events in a family. Reading the second story as a tragic story. Allow us to approach the text in the same way as we did previously. It frames the story as a description of the worst possible conduct to teach us a lesson. The story describes a natural phenomenon by telling us the story of the first family structure created. Point out the inevitable differentiation of two brothers and warn us about the consequences of showing a preference for one of the kids over the other. The first lesson of the story is related to parenthood, teaching the first and most important lesson regarding creating a healthy family. Don't love or show preference. The jealousy between kids and their pursuit of their parents' attention and admiration is an innate and international phenomenon. It is the parents' responsibility to act this way to promise a healthy family structure. God shows a preference for one contribution and not for the other, regardless of good intentions and hard work, creating jealousy between the brothers. God came to Cain and asked him, Genesis 4:7, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen?" Genesis 4:8, "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." God shows ignorance toward the suffering of Cain, and it seems he is not aware of the reason for it. From a perspective of a father, such a reaction is understandable. In many cases, the attitude of a father toward the less admired son is done without any malice. The father may be concentrated on trying to help the first while neglecting the second. In another case, it is possible that as the father considers the first son to be in good shape, he does not involve himself as much as for the second son, creating a feeling of abandonment. Such a case can also emerge in the best of families. It is common and sometimes inevitable, and it is even possible that it is unavoidable. The second part of God's answer makes everything more complicated. Instead of letting Cain respond and explain his pain, he hits the wounded boy with some hard truth. Rephrasing the first part of Genesis 4:7 can be seen as a reinforcement. If you know you are doing good, you should know it and have confidence in yourself. Up to this point, the intention of God's comment seems positive and even constructive. An important lesson is helping a kid have confidence in his action and worth. If God's statement finished at this point, it could have been a good begging of an open conversation between a father and his son. On the other side, as the reaction of God does not finish there, the question can be translated into its negative. If you feel not appreciated enough, is it not because you are not doing enough? In this case, the response is quite harsh, and it puts the blame for the natural need of a kid for his father's appreciation on the shoulders of the kid. Looking at the context and the following statement, the second interpretation seems the right approach to the text. God continues with a follow-up statement in Genesis 4:7. And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. It is easy to understand how this comment can be heard as follows. If you continue with this frustration, you will be punished. All the anger and frustration you feel is natural. You need to get over it. Some people reading the text will say that it is an important lesson to learn. Getting over one feeling is part of stepping into maturity. There is no doubt that this is true. But is it the role of a parent? Parents are children's support and safety net, and part of their job is to be there, guide, and listen to their kids' needs. Developing feelings and self-esteem is one of the most complicated and essential parts of any healthy teenager's evolution. Moments of crisis, especially inside the family structure, are great opportunities to teach a kid how to handle his emotions correctly. The incapability of a parent to be there and address these issues correctly can bring long-term effects on the kid's emotional development, maturity, and relationship with his parents, or authority in general. As a good tragic story, God decides to ignore the pain of his kid, throwing him back into the world after telling him he should get over his problems and get on with them. Feeling lost, angry, and abandoned, Cain decides to do something about his pain. As he cannot turn it against his father, the only other option is to turn it against his brother. The lack of communication in this case has created a wall that leaves the kid alone and desperate. Alternative consequences of such a situation can be seen as kids that turn to gangs, violence, and drugs. As they do not find the comfort of support at home, they will go and search for answers by acting based on their own impulse. As adolescents are high in hormones and have little life experience, any shortcut or place that will offer what they lack will be accepted. This crisis in an adolescent life is common, and it is part of growing up and becoming an adult. The capacity of the parents to be there and guide their kid is crucial. The first and more important part of the parent's support and capacity to solve this kind of crisis is to learn how to listen. Listening is a capacity we greatly lack these days. To listening is to detach one from his own world and importance and concentrate 100% of one attention on the person that is talking. Then, after hearing the other person's story, try and see it from their side, regardless of one's own emotions or opinion. Finally, show understanding and see how the problem can be fixed within the reasonable boundaries of the parent's personality. It is not an easy task. As a parent, being able to detach yourself from your fears and authoritative role is a complex task, and it requires patience and consciousness. Moreover, becoming aware of the pain of a kid can trigger some inner defense mechanisms that can prevent the healthy development of a constructive conversation, especially if the subject at hand has to do with the failure of the parent in his role. Failure of a parent to be there in the moment of crisis can bring the worst long-term outcomes for the child and the relationship between both sides. The parent's responsibility is to be the mature part of the conversation, both for the support of the mental stage of the kid and the example it serves for his development. It is not an easy task, but it must be carefully done for the benefit of everyone involved. Telling a kid what to do is different from explaining to him how and why to do something. In our story, God says, "Deal with it. If you keep being like this, some bad stuff will come your way." This is a wonderful demonstration of an unsupportive response of a parent concentrating on the what and not on the how or why. By doing so, God brings Cain from a place of frustration to a place of terror and anger. And so Cain goes away and, after a short reflection, calls his brother and kills him. The act of death in the story is the most extreme outcome possible. Practically, it can symbolize any extreme action an adolescent can choose to do, from violent acts to self-harm and drug use. Many more examples are smaller and less meaningful in the human being's spectrum of experiences. Regardless, it seems that what the story is trying to tell us is the importance of the parent's capacity to handle such a crisis and the potential consequences that follow. After killing his brother, Cain shows indifference when God asks about his brother's whereabouts. He avoids answering a direct question by saying in Genesis 4:9, "Am I my brother keeper?" This comment shows us how far and detached Cain is. Killing one's own brother is an act that affects one's soul. Killing another human is a complicated act, and killing one's brother is an extreme and traumatic event. Cain's reaction should be familiar to any parent handling an angry adolescent. This empathetic response, normally underlying the notion of "fuck you," is normal, and it shows how much disconnection there is between the sides. It will be absurd to believe Cain thought his act would not be revealed. After all, it is God we are talking about here. Cain's response is based on pure anger and lostness from the kid's side. Let us assume a more moderate example. A parent is against tattoos. Following an unconstructive conversation with the parent, the kid, out of frustration for attention, goes and makes one, a really big one. I use this example as it is as permanent, but not as serious. If the kids have just acted out of anger and frustration, it will be reasonable that he will feel guilty and come to confess, unless he is afraid or lost. Both cases should make the parent reflect on their own behavior, and it should raise an immediate red flag. This kind of behavior is often a cry for her help. "I need your love and attention. I have a problem. Please help me." In case the parent missed it up to this point, a constructive reaction from the parent's side for the recreation of a healthy relationship between the sides. Killing your brother is the most extreme act possible. It is a tragic event for all the family and one that is hard to recover from. Regardless, finishing the story like that will leave readers with a single lesson about parenthood, adolescence, and the horrible outcome of neglect. The story seems to take us forward and try to show us more. The reaction of God to Cain's actions is interesting, as it does not start with a description of a direct punishment at the hands of God. Oppositely, the text is written in a way that indicates that no punishment has been given by God at all. It says in Genesis 4:11, "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." The text can be read as a description of the consequences of Cain's actions and not a punishment from God per se. The text does not say, "I will punish you. I will not see you any longer." Instead, it describes the punishment as a direct, natural reaction of nature to his actions. In our context, the punishment is a metaphor. The land as a whole will not react to him badly, and since God has given no punishment, the wanderer and fugitive aspects are not referring to any specific place. The metaphor seems to refer to the inner world of Cain. As we mentioned above, killing one's own brother takes a mental toll. Like any other extreme act, the doer of the act is the one that needs to live with his actions for the rest of his life. In this case, Cain. I believe that God shows a new and surprising side in this passage. He acts as a concerned parent, explaining to Cain his sin and its inevitable consequences. Looking at it from this angle, it can be said that God says, "Now, you will have to live with what you did. You will feel detached from your surroundings, always knowing what you have done. You will feel an emptiness that will prevent you from feeling any connection to places or people." This is an important part of the story. It teaches us about the emptiness and misery one holds with oneself for past actions. It is an integral part of all humans. We live with our mistakes, and no one, even God, can take them away. Additionally, it shows the limitation of a parent's capacity to repent for their kids' mistakes. It represents an important step in the maturity of the parent's relationship with their kids and the kids with the outside world. Genesis 4:14. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. While God describes the inevitable consequences of Cain's actions, Cain, from his side, blames his father for the punishment. Regardless, he accepts his punishment and shows concern. He says that he doesn't know what to do or if he will be able to survive in this way. It is the biggest burden of them all, living in the loneliness of our own sins. The idea that God does not punish Cain for his action shows the amount of care and compassion he has for his kid as a father figure. He ignores the accusation thrown toward him and reassures his son instead of lashing back. He says, You will survive, as you will have my support. Or, you will move on and thrive. You will never be alone. Many interpretations of the text see the mark of Cain as a symbol of punishment and excommunication. Framing the story this way has made me believe that the notion is false. The conversation about the mark is not presented as a punishment, but as a protection from the world's loneliness, and it seems more like a sign of love than one of humiliation. The reaction of God to Cain is admirable in many ways. It shows restraint, love, and caring regardless of one son's sins. God's protection from far shows us that there are some actions that cannot be forgotten, but that nevertheless, forgiveness for one's child is possible. The story continues and describes how Cain walks the earth and finds himself a new home where he finds a wife and has a kid with her. His kid created a dynasty that brought forward clans of several tribes, giving the story a positive end. An important lesson is presented to us at the end of the story, one that has to do with our capacity to move forward and succeed regardless of our past mistakes. Cain had a bad relationship with his father in the early stages of the story, causing him to kill his brother and walk away from home with the mental burden of his action. Regardless, he manages to find a new place to call home, a wife, and see his kids and grandsons grow old. Moreover, Cain Tree created a legacy as his grandsons evolved into tribes. It is not obvious by any stretch of the imagination that this will be the outcome of such a story. We had all the reasons to believe that no good would come up in the end. Looking at the story as a whole, there is one open question that we never addressed. If God never punished Cain, why is God the father figure and not Adam? Is there an act in the story that requires God as an omnipotent figure in this story? It seems to me that not. If so, why God's presence is needed? Is God's presence in this story is there to show how a divine capacity? These questions bring our conversation to a new perspective on Cain and Abel's story. The first explanation for the presence of God in the story can be answered in two different ways. The first one is in line with our interpretation up until this point, and the second opens the door to the second interpretation described at the beginning of this chapter. The first interpretation is based on the idea that the story exists to teach us some important lessons about family. If addressed this way, we can say that God's existence as the father figure shows us the inevitability and universality of the events in the story. It allows us to reach a conclusion about the complexity of creating and family and maintaining a healthy relationship structure within it. By involving God, the failure of the father to show equal preference to both of his sons and handle Cain's jealousy constructively is presented as an unavoidable life development of any family structure. God's forgiveness and protection of Cain after the murder is also an act of divine compassion to one's own son. It is not obvious that this would be the reaction of a father to such a heartbreaking situation. Presenting these actions as God teaches us what could be the right reaction to such a tragedy. The second explanation takes us in a completely other direction. In this interpretation, God is seen as Cain's inner voice. As I mentioned at the book's beginning, God's existence can be seen as the inner world of a human being. As we will see in Noah's story, such an approach is worth considering. It opens to us a door toward a new perspective, turning the story on its head and allowing us to reach new insights. The second version of the story is directed towards adolescence. It focuses on mental development and the consequences of the incapacity to manage them correctly. It is an important lesson that needs to be considered. The capacity of an adolescent to control his feelings is essential in the process of reaching adulthood. Emotions are an inseparable part of human existence. Adults learn to separate feeling from logic over time, allowing a long, responsible vision, one that benefits their happiness, families, and society as a whole. If we approach the story this way, the underappreciated felt by Cain is related to his feelings and not to the actual actions of his father figure. In the story, it is just written that God preferred Abel's offering. In no place is there a mention of how it was shown or what were the consequences of this discrimination. It can be said that the statement that God preferred Abel is based on a subjection observation. If so, it allows us to assume that all the description of the situation is presented not as an objective fact, but as a subjective point of view. Cain's point of view. The conversation between God and Cain takes another tone when approaching the story in this way. It is a conversation between Cain and himself in his own head. In this conversation, which is very one-sided, Cain is faced with his own feelings and tries to understand them. Genesis 4:6. Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? It is very common that we speak to ourselves as a second external person in our head, especially when confronting our own feeling or posing doubts about our past actions. These questions posed by Cain to himself should be familiar and trivial to any person reading these pages. The answer to his question is typical of an adolescent dealing with an inner conflict. It contains some riddles, generalizations, and a command based on what the person's inner voice believes to be right. The answer can be read as follows: why are you feeling this way? If you were doing everything right, would you not get what you were expecting for? Abstract riddle. No, if you continue to be in this stage, only bad will come out of it. Generalization. Get over yourself. Master your anger. You are better than this. Command. The actions of Cain following this inner conflict represent the failure of an adolescent to contain his emotions. It shows us the struggle and the complexity of being an adolescent. The extreme execution of Cain's jealousy represents the violent struggle we all live through in our own minds while growing up. It represents a person's capacity to accept the world peacefully as it is compared to the world we believe should be. It is a struggle known to any human being, and part of our life, struggle toward maturity. The struggle between what one should and is a universal concept and part of each human struggle. The majority of our inner misery can be described as the process of identifying the difference between what one is and what one should be, accepting the person that one is, and building the correct expectation about oneself and the life around him. Psychology, as a profession, is based on this struggle. Ignoring this struggle or not evolving through it can bring people to depression, anxiety, and violent acts. I believe it to be part of human evolution as early as we started to think and reflect. It applies to all humans regardless of place, time, and race. After killing his brother, Cain starts by ignoring his act and suppressing its existence, a reaction that can be understood due to the severity of the act. The repression is so deep that he asks himself, "Where is my brother?" This repression of reality can be seen in post-traumatic events. We most commonly think of these cases when thinking about the victim of the event. But in many cases, if the act has been made in a moment of rage, erasing the event can happen in the mind of an unstable person. Cain's reaction to the question regarding the whereabouts of his brother can also be seen as extreme protection and denial in such a case. "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" can be seen as a defense mechanism in action. This conversation can be seen as a struggle between the consciousness of Cain fighting itself. On one side, he represses the event deeply, making him believe his brother is still alive, while his consciousness is pushing back and asking for its whereabouts. Genesis 4:11 can be seen as the breaking point and admission of Cain to himself with his actions. "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." The fact that a dead person is screaming at you from the ground is very possible in one person's own head. It hunts him and does not let him move forward. The mental consequences of his actions seem realistic, describing the pain and regret of Cain's actions. Being cursed by the ground and being a fugitive and wanderer are self-inflicted punishments for one's actions. As I mentioned previously, the text doesn't indicate that these punishments were an external decision inflicted by an angry person. As we see in the text, no one is practically banishing Cain away. If so, Cain will be a fugitive from who? It is not indicated that any person will seek revenge for his action. The only entity that can hunt him down is Cain himself, confronting his own acts and living with them for the rest of his life. By realizing the burden of his actions, Cain states that his punishment is greater than he can bear. When looking at the text previously, I wrote that this sentence from the side of Cain seemed to me out of his place. God did not banish him or curse the ground, but just observed the consequences of Cain's actions. This sentence makes a lot of sense when approaching the text from an inner voice angel. If the punishment is mental, it is inflected from within. The idea that we punish ourselves for our own actions is very familiar to us and to the world of psychology. In this case, Cain, that understands the long-term mental effects inflicted on him by his conscience, can say that his punishment is too heavy to bear. While we approach the story from a different angle, the lesson here is the same. It is the unbreakable and inevitable existence of cause and effect. The process that has brought Cain to kill his brother is different, based not on the angle we choose, but the action and its consequences remain the same. When applying this frame of thought, the most important lesson we can learn from the story of Cain and Abel is the inevitable causality of actions. The lesson addresses the stage of adolescence and the ignorance in this stage of the way of life. In this stage, the capacity to see further than one emotion and impulse is lacking. The story's first and most important lesson is a warning to adolescents and their parents of the long-term effects of not learning to control these urges correctly. It presents us with the need each adolescent has for guidance and their incapability to handle it by themselves. It is a lesson that seems universal and applies to all times and races, as it is based on the nature of man as man. After realizing the burden Cain will have to bear for his actions, he is described as entering into a mode of fear and anxiety, a state of despair and loneliness. He sees the world as cold, dark, and without hope for empathy. The sentence, "Anyone who meets me may kill me," can be seen as a metaphor for rejection or humiliation. After all, without the support of another human, one can hardly manage to survive. The despair can be seen in a different light, in which he addresses his mental stage toward the future events in his life. In this case, anyone refers to any future challenges he will meet. With broken confidence and the exhaustion of his soul, Cain says he doesn't believe he will be able to overcome any challenge that will come towards him in the future. At this point, his inner voice is there to support him and tell him, "No, you will live and survive. and the lesson from today will be a scar that will make you stronger. With this strength, every challenge that will come will build in you the strength to move forward. While it is quite a stretch to take God's reaction in the story to this interpretation, it will not be absurd to believe that this is the mental stage Cain arrived at when he managed to resolve his inner conflict. Another way to look at the text will be to separate Cain's reactions and stretch them over time. We assume that the dialogue is continuous as it is presented in one paragraph. It could very well be that the text presents the crisis, the conflict, the realization, and the resolution of the mental process altogether. If addressed in this way, we witness the full path one has to take toward self-resolution. As the end of the story shows us that Cain manages to move on, it is possible to apply a reverse conclusion. Without Cain's mental strength, he could never reach the happy end of the story. The story of Cain and Abel come to teach us an important lesson about the conflict and struggle any adolescent pass and its possible horrific outcomes. Combining both approaches is possible, as it doesn't contradict the main lessons we can extract from the story. Oppositely, it gives us a more complete picture of this experience and all the people involved with it. From the parent's point of view, the text tries to warn parents of the danger of neglecting one kid for the other. As much as it is hard and sometimes inevitable, it reminds us of the importance of appreciating each kid based on what he can and love doing, and not based on what a parent would like his kid to be. It shows the parents the importance of being there for their kids when they see that a problem exists, and the importance of creating an open, compassionate, and constructive dialogue with the kid. It reminds us that regardless of our wish as a parent to teach our kids important lessons for life, sometimes the way to do it is by following the kid's needs and not hitting him with the hard truth and sending him to handle it. Additionally, it shows that as parents, regardless of the horrible consequences of the action of one kid, compassion, support, and forgiveness are the only reaction that will give a kid a chance to move forward and create a future. While it is not always easy and sometimes even divine, the solution exists. Eventually, the forgiveness of one parent is a guide and example for self-forgiveness. From the adolescent's point of view, the story teaches us about the existence of urges and the devastating consequences of acting upon them. It shows us the inevitable rules of the universe and the need to share one pain. Approaching the text with the inner voice approach can show adolescents the importance of not handling one problem alone. Our inner world can be of great help, but can also be a dark place with little support. We can learn about the pain of our actions, the loneliness of our thoughts, and the struggle we all pass from time to time. Regardless of all the events, the story finishes with a happy ending, one that shows that it is possible to move on. We can overcome our past and create something great with the right strength, support, and self-determination. It doesn't mean for a moment that we can kill and ravage without consequences. It shows us that regardless of pain, fear, and wrongdoing, it is possible to do better.